Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The horrific afterlife of Mary, Queen of Scots. Throughout history, there has been a lot of discussion around the imprisonment and execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, at the hands of the English. In previous videos, we have discussed Mary's life and her downfall, and the key players in her destruction. But the question I find myself asking is, what happened to Mary after she died? In today's video, we are going to explore the day of Mary's execution, and then the horrific afterlife that she suffered. So please join us today for the horrific afterlife of Mary, Queen of Scots. And remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Now the final stop for Mary would be Fotheringhay Castle. She had spent the last 20 years in captivity in one form or other, with various spells of time at multiple locations throughout England. But it would be at Fotheringhay where Mary, Queen of Scots, would meet the executioner that she had been waiting 2 decades for. On the 7th of February 1587, Elizabeth I's representatives arrived at Fotheringhay Castle, and they arrived at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They read an order regarding the execution, and they said that the task of executing Mary, Queen of Scots, would take place in the morning of the 8th of February 1587, between 7 and 8 o'clock. Mary's jailer was then ordered to prepare everything for her execution, and Mary surprisingly thanked the Queen's men for ending her miserable imprisonment. It was clear that Mary had had enough of her life, and had been broken by the limitations of her imprisonment. She did beg for more time to sort out her affairs, but the Count of Shrewsbury replied, "No, madam, you must die. Be ready between 7 and 8 in the morning." Mary then spent the rest of the day writing farewell letters and in prayer. However, whilst this was occurring, the execution chamber was being prepared. Inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, the execution was being prepared. A scaffold had been erected, in which black cloth had been draped all over, and it was reached by 2 or 3 steps. Onto the scaffold sat a block and a cushion which Mary could kneel on, and there were also 3 stools. These were for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were there to witness the execution. On the morning of the 8th of February, Mary had entered the great hall on time, and it was said she entered full of grace and majesty, as if she was coming to a ball, and as she approached the scaffold in the centre of the room, she asked for help up onto the scaffold, climbing the few steps. There on the scaffold, she did ask for her priest to be with her, but this was refused. She had been offered a Protestant priest, however, this was of great offence to Mary. She asked that the Queen should spare her ladies-in-waiting, and she prayed that Britain and Scotland would be converted to Catholicism. Following this, on the scaffold, she summoned her ladies-in-waiting. They helped her remove her black veil and her headdress, along with other jewellery that she was wearing. The executioner attempted to help Mary. However, she screamed, "Nay, my good man, touch me not." Mary's ladies helped her reveal a striking velvet petticoat and a pair of sleeves in brown. Her executioner Bull, along with his assistant, then knelt down before Mary and asked for her forgiveness, and she said that she willingly forgave him, and she hoped that her sins would be forgiven by God. Mary wore a golden crucifix made from wood that was thought to have come from the true cross of Jesus Christ. She reached out for her ladies-in-waiting once more, telling them to go, and she made the sign of the cross to them. There was much crying from the ladies, and they were told to pray for God, for her soul. One of her closest ladies, Jane Kennedy, gave Mary a white handkerchief embroidered in gold and tied the blindfold around Mary. Then Mary knelt down and faced her death with great courage in front of around 500 people who were there to witness, many of whom were moved to tears and were emotional. She positioned her head bravely on the block and said her final words, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," before stretching out her arms, giving the executioner the sign that the Queen was ready to die. Mary's execution was not simple, and it did not go to plan. In front of the witnesses, in the great hall of Fotheringhay, it was bloody and brutal. Mary was allegedly not beheaded with a single strike. The executioner missed her neck with the first blow and struck the back of her head. The second blow then severed her neck, except for a tiny part of sinew in which her head was still attached to her body. The executioner then sliced through the sinew with his axe, and he then held up Mary's head to declare the death of her as a traitor. As he held Mary's head up to the crowd, he declared, "God save the Queen," and at that moment, Mary's head fell to the floor. The auburn wig she was wearing slipped from her head, revealing that she did in fact have very short grey hair, and her head then rolled off towards the edge of the scaffold in a shocking sight, and it was said that her lips stirred up and down for a quarter of an hour after her head was struck off. Now Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed on the 8th of February 1587, but Mary's murder would not be the end for her. You see, anything related to the deceased queen was burnt and destroyed in the fireplace of the Great Hall, including the cloth from the scaffold and any personal effects that Mary had, to prevent relic hunters and martyrdom. Elizabeth, however, is said to have instantly regretted the decision to permit and sanction Mary's execution, and eventually the two would rest within the same church, as James I of England, Mary's son, interred Mary inside Westminster Abbey in a chapel opposite Elizabeth I's tomb. Now, after Mary's execution, her body was embalmed, but it is said that her entrails were removed in this process, before being buried secretly within the grounds of the castle. Mary then spent the next 6 months inside of a lead coffin within the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. It appears that Elizabeth was slow to give the order for Mary to be laid to rest. Mary had asked to be buried with her first husband, Francis II of France, but this request was refused, and instead Mary was taken to Peterborough Cathedral and buried there. Queen Elizabeth I had been reluctant to condemn another anointed sovereign and her cousin to death, and despite Mary's suspected involvement in plots against her, it is said that the execution was carried out against the wishes of Elizabeth, and she was therefore furious with the councillors who carried it out. Now, after 6 months of being kept within the dark castle walls, Mary was finally given the funeral she deserved. Although saying that, I do believe that Mary would not have approved of the service, for it was a Protestant burial service, and of course Mary was a devout Roman Catholic. Now, Mary was initially taken to Peterborough by a torchlight in a chariot hung with black velvet and adorned with her ensigns. This was about 1 or 2 a.m. on the 30th of July. The transportation of the body was attended to by the Bishop and Dean of Peterborough, along with other officials and members of Mary's household. Now, Mary's body was then laid to rest for a short while in the vault until the following day, where a variety of both lords and ladies arrived to attend a grand supper. It was then on the next day that a perfunctory sermon was held by the Bishop of Lincoln. He expressed a hope that Mary was saved, although this was not with great confidence, which is strange, as Mary was a devout Catholic when she died. It was then that Mary's officials broke their staves over her grave and placed them inside, before all the mourners attended yet another grand feast. It took Mary 6 months after her death to be laid to rest, but only 25 years later, on the request of her son, James VI of Scotland and I of England, that Mary's body was exhumed. She was taken to Westminster Abbey, where James had her laid in an ornate marble tomb, next to her 2 cousins, Elizabeth I and Mary Tudor. With that being said, maybe James moving the remains of his mother was a good thing, because hindsight is a wonderful thing. In the year 1643, Mary's old tomb, although empty, was destroyed by Oliver Cromwell's forces when they were en route to attack the royalist garrison at Crowland. However, another queen buried within the walls of Peterborough Cathedral is Catherine of Aragon, and her tomb suffered a great amount of vandalism during the attack on the building. Along with this, the cathedral suffered broken stained glass windows, The altar, reredos, cloisters and Lady Chapel were also demolished. So although there are others who have suffered a great deal more than Mary after their deaths, what Mary experienced was barbaric. Her execution was botched. Her belongings were burnt to ash to prevent any relics being taken. Her entrails were removed and buried somewhere on the grounds of Fotheringhay Castle. And then she was left, alone, unable to rest within the walls of the same castle that she lost her life in. Mary, Queen of Scots, was true to herself right to the end, but after 20 years of imprisonment for being a risk to someone else's throne, she gave up, and who could blame her? May her soul rest in peace, and although her final wish to be buried with her husband Francis was not adhered to, I hope that they have found each other in the afterlife. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.